Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dr. Monique Alicasi. I am the director for first year writing program here at Howard University in our Department of English. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all back to today's session of the Octavia Butler Lecture Series, a cornerstone of our first year writing program here at Howard University in the Department of English. This series is not just a lecture series. Instead, it is a space for critical reflection, creative inquiry, and academic growth designed to empower our students to engage with transformative ideas and voice in literature. As many of you know, Octavia Butler's Kindred is indeed our common read for the semester. And her work serves as a profound lens through which we explore themes of identity, race, history, Afrofuturism, womanism, and the list goes on. Butler's writing pushes us to consider what it means to navigate the complexities of time, memory, and power. Issues that are not only relevant to our understanding of the past, but also to our lives in the present and future. Kendrick teaches us about the importance of understanding our histories, however difficult they may be, and it urges us to confront the ways in which they shape our personal and collective experiences. So, this lecture series is an essential component of the first year writing program as it offers students an opportunity to hear from distinguished scholars, writers, and leaders who share a commitment to exploring the intersections of literature, social justice, and cultural transformation. Values that we indeed reflect both Butler's work and our university's mission. Through this program, we aim to enhance your engagement with academic writing, critical thinking, and rhetorical skills, all while encouraging you to draw connections between this text that you are currently studying and the world around you. It is now my honor to welcome with us today Dr. Corey Lamont, who will be doing the introduction of our keynote speaker today. And our keynote speaker today, we're very happy to have with us Dr. Kendra Parker. So we thank you all for being with us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Corey Lamont.
Thank you, Dr. Akasi. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this second of our two-part lecture series. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kendra Parker, someone who I know well, because Dr. Parker and I actually were in the graduate program together here at Howard. I was thinking about this today and I was just like, I cannot believe so much time had passed because we both came into the program around 2008, and Dr. Parker graduated in 2014. So it seems like a long time ago. But in any event, Dr. Parker is a scholar and educator with a passion for teaching and research. And her scholarly publications reflect her varied interests. These include Black vampires, Black horror, literary Afrofuturism, and the works of Octavia E. Butler, among other topics. In 2018, Dr. Parker published her debut book, She Bites Back, Black Female Vampires in African American Women's Novels, 1977 to 2011, and that was published by Lexington Books. She has co-edited, along with her mentor, the late Dr. Gregory Hampton, who was also a professor in the Department of English here at Howard. The book's title is The Bloomsbury Handbook to Octavia Butler, which was published in 2020. That same year, Dr. Parker also achieved a personal goal of hers, which was to co-edit a special issue of the College Language Association Journal with Dr. Dana Williams, who is now Dean Williams in the graduate school. The issue titled For Us, To Us, About Us, Racial Unrest and Cultural Transformation was widely received. In 2022, Dr. Parker appeared on NPR's It's Been a Minute to discuss the Interview with the Vampire series. Her forthcoming book, Understanding Octavia E. Butler, which is being published by the University of South Carolina Press, is scheduled for release April of next year. The project was supported by a 2023 Andrew Mellon Fellowship and a Georgia Southern Scholarly Pursuit grant, which allowed Dr. Parker to conduct archival research at the Huntington Library. Her scholarly writing spans topics such as Roxane Gay's Hunger, the horror fiction of Tananarive Due, and films like Vamp, Vampire in Brooklyn, and Twilight. Dr. Parker is also interested in pedagogy, and so she's also given workshops on online teaching strategies. These reflect her broader academic interests. In 2024, the introduction to her first book, She Bites Back, will be republished in Broadview's Vampire Literature and Anthology. Outside of her professional work, Dr. Parker enjoys reading, watching television, making videos of her cat Mo. Recently, she's been engrossed in new Black vampire fiction, such as Haley Dennings's The Ravenous Fate, which was published this year, and also Tejas Girma's Immortal Dark, which was also published this year. For a great Halloween read, she recommends Tananarive Due's The Good House, which was published in 2003, or Tiffany Jackson's White Smoke, which was published in 2021. Again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kendra R. Parker.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm always super excited to come back home. And so I really appreciate the invitation from Dr. Akasi way back during the summer for inviting me to present here. And of course, my colleague, Dr. Lamont, thank you for that introduction. It has been a long time. It has been a long time. And one of the things I love about coming home is that I wouldn't be who I am without Howard University and the Department of English. And I always sort of get a little emotional thinking about this because Dr. Hampton was the one who introduced me to Octavia E. Butler. I fell in love with her work because of him in particular. And so his passing in 2019, shook a lot of us. And I often, I do my presentations because it's something that we always wanted to do together. So a lot of this is done in memoriam for him. And so my upcoming book, part of it is dedicated to him and his life and legacy. So, so as I was preparing for this presentation, it's really hard to sort of come back home and not to start thinking about legacy. And so, of course, a bunch of different moments came to mind. Dr. Lamont already mentioned one. It's been 10 years since I defended my dissertation and since I became Dr. Parker. I can't go without mentioning Howard's 100th homecoming just last week. I'm sure y'all all had a great time. But it's also a big year for Butler, too. One of the things is that 2024 in particular is a big year for Butler because it's the year that her novel, Parable of the Sower, begins. Now, the novel itself is actually published in 1993, so 30 years ago last year, but it opens in 2024. And in her imagined 2024, some things happen that we may recognize. So there's an astronaut stranded in space. There's a hurricane that travels from the Gulf of Mexico, wreaking havoc and destruction across several states. There's water shortages, pandemics, police brutality, and so much more. And in the sequel, Parable of the Talents, which is published in 1998, Butler presents us with a presidential candidate whose presidential slogan is "Make America Great Again." And so the books are fantastic, slightly terrifying, and even though they're kind of bleak, they actually do offer us possibilities for hope and practical change. But you might wonder, why am I talking about Parable of the Sower when we're supposed to be talking about kindred? And the answer is really, really simple. It's that both are deeply concerned with the idea of legacy, how the past informs the present and how the present shapes the future. And so today I want to bridge those works and their shared themes of legacy. And so to do that, I want to start with some words from Parable of the Talents. They read, "We have lived before, we will live again. We will be silk, stone, mind, star. We will be scattered, gathered, molded, probed. We will live, and we will serve life. We will shape God, and God will shape us again, always again, forevermore." Now, that's a poem, and it's a passage from a funeral service in Parable of the Talents. It speaks to the cycles of life, death, and rebirth, underscored by the repetition of "we will," which appears 6 times, and then sort of reinforced at the end with "again, always again, forevermore." But for me, it's not just a poem, it's a manifesto about resilience and legacy. And Butler's writing often returns to that importance of leaving a legacy. That's something that Howard University champions with Dr. Akasi's introduction. We clearly know that the first year writing program champions it with this virtual series. And I'm going to assume that it matters to each of you because you're here, whether by force or by choice or by interest. And so I'm assuming that it matters to you. And Butler, of course, herself believed in this legacy building. One of the things that she would often say in interviews is that an adolescent fantasy of hers was to live forever and breed people. And so because her works are interconnected, I want to frame today's talk, "We Will Shape Spaces, Legacy, Imagination, and Community," around the "we will" poem. Because for me, the phrase "we will" is defiant. It's a declaration of presence in both the now and the future. And while Kindred centers on the past and Dana's future, I also think it calls on us to think about the present. And so first, I want us to think about being space makers and explore how Butler was a space maker, pioneering spaces for herself and for other people. So last summer, like Dr. Lamont mentioned, I did get to go to the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. I spent a month there, and Butler's archived papers are all housed there. I mean, her journals, her book manuscripts, her notes, affirmations, receipts, cards, letters to her fake nemesis and things like that. Everything she wrote, they're in the archives. There are about 398 boxes. And a number of things stand out, but one of the things that Butler has become most known for in recent years is her affirmations. And so the "we will" in Parable of the Talents really does mirror the "I am" affirmations that are actually pictured on your screen. And Butler used these "I am" affirmations throughout her life to repeatedly motivate herself. They were crucial to her process. And so on the left side of the screen, it reads, "I am to write novels and stories that grasp and compel, that seduce, that addict and hold." I won't read everything from the center, but the key takeaways are: I am to have a home of my own with large rooms. I am to have a top place on the bestseller list for my novels. I am to have the Nobel Prize for Literature. While she didn't get the Nobel Prize for Literature, she did get the bestseller list posthumously after her passing for Parable of the Sower back in 2020. And then the one on the right in red ink, she writes, "I am a writer. I write. I am a selling writer. I sell what I write. I live to write. Every day, in every way. I write better, faster, and more." And so these affirmations really are, for me, a reflection of her tenacity. They're evidence of her creating space despite a number of obstacles. One of the reasons her work is so important is because she really did introduce Black women's perspectives into the genre of science fiction, which was a genre that was dominated by white men. But 50 years ago, on October 6, 1974, just 1 year before publishing her novel Pattern Master, and then 1 year before several of her works got published in rapid succession, she wrote about her struggle with failure. And she said, "What I am weary of is failure, that to begin, that to persist having begun, that to finish having persisted, what I must make for myself is a success." And so this was Butler's reality for years. She was tired of failing. She said she was tired of working grubby jobs. She was trying to stave off depression, suicidal ideation, but she persisted with her affirmations, carving out a space for herself in a world that wasn't ready for her stories, where she didn't see herself in her stories, but she still knew that they needed to be told. And so in this way, we can actually consider Butler an Afronaut. And that's a term that Dr. Brianna C. Whiteside uses to describe a person of African descent in space, or someone who explores new frontiers. And so for Butler, it wasn't like outer space and galaxies, although she was certainly interested in that. These frontiers are both literal and literary. So she ventured into science fiction, a genre, a space that was then occupied by people like her. As a matter of fact, she once said, "I wasn't in any of this stuff that I read, so I wrote myself in." And so through Kindred and Butler wrote Dana as a character who reflected herself. Dana was tall, Black, and androgynous, and so was Butler. But Butler also wrote Dana as someone who she wanted to be, a successful writer who experiences mutual love, affection, and sexual satisfaction. Butler was deeply lonely and she longed for romantic companionship, and she never married, although she really wanted to. And so when she didn't see herself, she wrote. When she didn't see herself the way she wanted to see herself, she wrote. So she wrote her characters not just for who she was, but also for who she wanted to be. And so in doing so, she doesn't just make space for herself in the world of science fiction. She makes space and created spaces for an entire generation of Black writers. One quick example is Tananarive Due, who just won the World Fantasy Award for her novel, I think just last week. And she absolutely credits her work to Butler. So does Tomi Adeyemi, N.K. Jemisin. So many writers indebt themselves to Butler because they say without her, they would not exist. But Butler wasn't just a space maker. She also imagined new spaces, and in doing so, she participated in a long-standing tradition of African-American literature, Black literature really, of Black imagination and the practice of envisioning Black futures, which is what we have come to know as Afrofuturism. And so the question, of course, then becomes, what is Afrofuturism, right? And it's been described in various ways. Sometimes there are competing definitions, but it is for sure considered an aesthetic genre. And so basically that's just science fiction written by Black people for Black people. And so Butler's Dawn is one example. But it's also a critical lens, which is basically a way of reading that highlights the connections between science, technology, and race. And so Dr. Alondra Nelson is really an early pioneer of this, even though she's not credited with coining the term Afrofuturism, in her 2002 special journal issue, Social Text, which she actually did while she was a graduate student. And she's also described Afrofuturism as Black voices with other stories to tell about culture, technology, and things to come. So you can think of Afrofuturism as a genre, as a critical lens, or as a cultural phenomenon, which is basically where Black people, see themselves in relation to technology, specifically Western technologies, and especially through the themes that symbolize the legacies of enslavement, so abduction, alienation, and displacement. And one example is Sunrise musical Space is the Place, where the protagonist is basically a jazz musician who doesn't believe that Black people deserve to be treated the way they are. So he travels through space on a spaceship that looks like a pyramid to find a new place, a Black utopia for Black people. And then Afrofuturism is also an aesthetic production, so where you blend myth and history to imagine new Black cultures and futures. And we might think of Ryan Coogler's Black Panther here, but I wanted to pick Constellation One, which is a 2016 painting by a UK artist, Lena Iris Victor, as an example, mostly because Octavia Butler's name is Estelle, which means star, so constellation star. I simply thought it was fitting. And so Afrofuturism takes many forms, whether you decide to think of it or approach it as an aesthetic genre, a critical lens, a cultural phenomenon, or an aesthetic production, or if you're like one of my students who was like, Afrofuturism, I just know it when I see it. It's important, but its core is about imagining Black futures beyond oppressions. And so within this context, we can understand that We Will from Parable of the Talents as a commitment to imagining Black futures. And because we're talking about Kindred, I have to talk about genre, specifically how Kindred engages in the genre of the 19th century tradition of the slave narrative. And so slave narrative is a first-person account published in the 19th century of a formerly enslaved Black person's life there and how they endure and eventually liberate themselves into freedom. But they also follow a particular structure, and this structure is really important for understanding Kindred. And so the first thing that appears in a slave narrative is authenticating material, what we call the authentication. And so basically it's a preface or a letter that's written by a white benefactor that basically says the person who wrote this, they're reliable, what they say is true, and any so-called quote deficiencies in their writing doesn't take away from the veracity of their claims. And so you needed this white person to convince free white people to read these narratives to sort of champion the cause for abolition, because the purpose of a slave narrative was to champion for the abolition of slavery. The next thing that appears is slavery as hell on earth. You get the person's life, all of the hardships that they endure, and then once they liberate themselves, typically they end with a renaming of self or a commitment to anti-slavery activism, or sometimes both. And so Kindred is not a slave narrative, but it is a neo-slave narrative, and it participates in a long tradition. And so a neo-slave narrative is essentially a modern tale of bondage to freedom. Typically, they're published in the mid-20th century or later, and they reimagine the experience of enslaved Black people through modern lenses. For the case of Kindred, literally we see Dana traveling back and forth to antebellum America, but in Asai's autobiography, she's talking about her incarceration and likening that to chattel enslavement and the things that she goes through. You've also got Margaret Walker's Jubilee, Toni Morrison's Beloved, and I even argue that Roxane Gay's memoir is a 21st century, sort of participates in the 21st century freedom narrative. And so it's really important to think about this in the context of the literary tradition. And we can see it in a couple of ways. So it's a first person story for sure. We get I lost an arm on my last trip home, but it's a novel. And so there's no preface by a white person saying that this is true, but there is a moment of authentication. And so Dana's white husband, Kevin, doesn't really believe that she's been transported back to the past. He knows something happened. He was like, I don't know what to think. But when he travels back in time with her, the third time she goes back, he grabs onto her, he's there, and he says, it happened, it's real. And that moment is important because it validates Dana's experiences for Kevin and any skeptical readers. And it prevents a reader from dismissing her experiences as hallucinations or fantasy. And so the fact that it's a white man who provides this validation really does continue the complex and problematic dynamics of this so-called need for authentication. But he does indeed authenticate her story. And then, of course, Slavery as Hell on Earth, Kindred is indeed a narrative full of hope and possibility, but also lots of trauma. We remember Alice's father being beaten. Butler has a harrowing description that really does activate all of the senses, the sight, the smell, the taste of his sweat. We witnessed Dana's own beating, her attempt by suicide, rape, all of these things. So absolutely, Kindred positions this as slavery as hell on earth. But the renaming of self or the recommitment to anti-slavery activism doesn't actually appear, but it doesn't mean that Kindred doesn't have a sort of rebirth of Dana. And we see that rebirth of Dana through the loss of her arm. The novel, begins, I lost the arm on my last trip home. Her arm is amputated. And part of that is she's been transformed by the past. Butler couldn't let her arrive back whole. And so while she's not a new person through a change of name, she is a new person through a change of body and mind. She's been forever altered by her experience. So cool. So how is Kindred Afrofuturist? So here's where I'd like to introduce Dr. Isaiah Lavender and his work, Afrofuturism Rising. I know y'all have some presentations coming up this semester and later on in the spring, and this might be a resource you're interested in using. So his work actually invites us to read early African-American literature and historical events through an Afrofuturist lens. So he's one who's using Afrofuturism as a critical reading practice. And in his book, he offers a number of terms that I think would be really useful. I'm just going to talk about three: the Hope Impulse, networked Black consciousness, and freedom technology. And so he defines the Hope Impulse as Black people's desire for a better life, for a better future, and for freedom itself, providing what he calls the basic intuitive urge, powering resistance, rebellion, and subversive writing. And typically when I talk to my students about this, they're a little bit put off because they think hope is just some sort of fleeting thought. And I'm like, no, hope is about action, right? It requires thought, it requires deed, it requires action. And one example of the hope impulse that he gives is Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion. He said that is literally the hope impulse at work. So in Kindred, we can see the hope impulse in a much smaller sense, right? Dana's very survival is tied to her resistance and her fight for a future, even if that future might come at the expense of Alice, because in order for her future to exist, Alice has to give birth to a daughter, and which means she has to engage in a sexual relationship that she does not want to with Rufus. Another term is the networked Black consciousness, which is basically collective memories, traditions that link past, present, and future. So whether this is quilting, whether this is the ring shout, or whether this is Dana traveling back and forth between time, seeing herself literally as a mirror image in Alice, sort of doppelgangers, demonstrating this connection across time, a sort of networked Black consciousness. And then finally, we have a freedom technology. And so Lavender basically says a freedom technology is any practical knowledge that helps Black people escape from psychological or physical bondage, and that most importantly allows them control of their own actions. And this may be a little controversial, but I chose the picture to go, the red cover to go with this, because the ribbons around Dana's arm, a couple of scholars argue that that's emblematic of her attempt at suicide. And if we're thinking through a Black tradition, enslaved Black people would sometimes choose death over enslavement because it was a form of freedom. And so in that regard, in that context, I think that we can see that Dana's attempt, suicide attempt, which sends her back home, functions as a freedom technology. She's got the knowledge. She knows that she believes that if she's going to die, she will leave. And so she does what she has to do. Now, the freedom is temporary because she goes back, but she does, it allows her to escape the physical and psychological bondage of Rufus, and she has control over her own actions in that moment. Now, understanding Kindred as Afrofuturist is also reflected in the number of different book covers that the novel has. So this first image is the 1979 hardcover edition published by Doubleday. The second cover is one that was published in 2004. The third is a 2003 cover from Beacon Press. This fourth one is from 2018. This fifth is from 2022, and this sixth one was actually released earlier this year in May. And I believe this last one actually pays homage to the first one in some really interesting ways. And for me, the first and the last one really speak to this idea of Afrofuturism through the font style. But it would be really cool, I think, to do some sort of project on sort of reading Afrofuturist impulses based on the book covers. Now, there are a couple of scholars who have already talked about visualizing Dana through these different covers. Their names are Christine Montgomery and Ellen C. Caldwell. And I will say that these are not all the covers of the novel. There are a few more, but it's really important to sort of look at the covers and see the development of the novel, like what's happening with this first cover that's published in 1979. And then some of these others that have a woman sort of looking longingly out into the distance. Some argue that this third one looks like the cover of a romance novel, which is something that Butler was absolutely against. One of her editors wanted her to name the novel Dana, and she was like, oh God, no, that means it's going to be a romance novel and nobody's going to read it. And so the politics of using a cover to sort of tell a story before you even open the book is something that I think would be really useful. And so what I hope that we think about today is that Kindred is both neo-slave narrative and Afrofuturist, right? With Dana's journey back and forth through time, she really does ask us to imagine Black futures that are rooted in a deep understanding of the past. And so the we will of Afrofuturism isn't just a promise, right? It's a reclamation, it's a declaration that Black people have always been and will continue to be architects of their own futures, our own futures, and that we will always, always, always imagine spaces. And so finally, the we will is also a call for community. And Kindred really does remind us about this importance of coalition building. One of the things that Dana does is she survives because of the women-centered networks that protect her. They're networks of solidarity and care. That fantastic scene to me where she runs away and Liza betrays her. Liza learns real quick when Sarah, Carrie, and Tess sort of take care of business and remind her that snitches get stitches, basically. And she doesn't snitch after that. And while, it's sort of tongue in cheek at that moment, that's a really important moment. And especially if we think about what Bell Hooks says, is that rarely, if ever, of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. And so is survival, I feel like. And so that moment there in the text and other moments throughout the text, Dana really does survive based on that. And one of the other things that appears in Kindred is when Dana's back in her 20th century present, she's listening to a news report about a war in Lebanon, and then she's listening about South African apartheid. And she compares that to the experiences that she's had in 19th century enslavement. And so what Butler does in that moment is really tries to let us think about community building and solidarity, not just here locally, but also globally. Like, what are we supposed to be doing? What building can we be doing? What connections can we be making across the diaspora, across the world? And so whether we're looking at these communities in as for survival, like women-centered networks, or think about coalition broadly, it's something that we're supposed to consider. I think that's what Kindred is asking us to consider. And so the question for you is, what networks are we tapping into and pouring into to protect and care for yourself, but also for others? Now, 31 years ago, on May 15th, 1993, Butler wrote, "Thinking about my legacy, about the things I hope to leave when I die. My books are most likely to last. They're like messages in bottles, beginning places. They might foster study or give directions for behavior modification. They might give the finders something to react against and find new paths for thought and or action." And so as you engage with Butler and Kindred, for this semester and next semester, I hope that you will think about her works as a way to seek out new paths for thoughts and actions. I hope you ask yourself, what legacy are you going to leave behind? And how is your we will going to shape your present and your future? And so, of course, I hope that you remember to be a space maker, to imagine spaces and share spaces by being in community. Thank you.
Outstanding, outstanding. Wow. I would like now to ask Dr. Lamont, and I appreciate Dr. Lamont and Dr. Green as well, because over the summertime, when we were thinking about renowned scholars, Dr. Green had mentioned you, and then Dr. Lamont said, "Oh, I have her contact information," and I said, "Oh, well, you have to get in contact with Dr. Parker," and so I want to publicly thank you, Dr. Lamont, for getting in touch with this renowned scholar. I know Octavia Butler is extremely proud today, and I love the earrings, by the way.
Oh, yeah, a book. I figured, a little plug.
Oh yeah, it's fire. It's fire. Yes. So at this time, Dr. Lamont, if you would kindly facilitate the Q&A, because I know people have questions and comments. Phenomenal presentation. Thank you, Dr. Parker. And Dr. Lamont, I'll turn it back over to you for the Q&A.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Sure. Thank you. Wasn't anticipating that, but I'll see if I can man the chat.
Howard, you got to come when you're called.
Right? But absolutely. And again, I want to extend my thanks to Kendra as well. Well, Dr. Parker for answering the call. So it was because there was a text and there was an immediate response. And I know sometimes, as scholars, as academics, we can be extremely busy. But she responded right away. And of course, like we said, answered the call. So we appreciate you. And yes, this definitely is a homecoming, and we're glad you decided to join us today. So thank you so much. And I'm sure the students and others who participated today were enriched by your presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So as far as questions, so you can either, let me see how I could do this. Drop your question in the chat, or you can actually do a hand raise. Let me see which is easier for me to follow. But yes, you can drop your question in the chat. It's probably easier for me to facilitate that way, because sometimes I might miss hand raises.
Okay, cool. Yeah, don't be shy. I'm happy to answer questions, comments.
I have a question. So I love how you shared how you discovered Octavia Butler through your mentor, your late great mentor. So what was it like when you were first introduced? Because a lot of our students are just blown away. This is their first time too being introduced to Butler, many of them, and it's amazing to read their organic reactions to see this, to read her for the first time. So can you share with us and with students as well, just so they know that you're not alone?
Not alone. This is recorded, but it's okay. I'm gonna tell the truth. So yes, Dr. Hampton did introduce me to Butler first, but I came across her book in undergrad. I was a senior, I was getting ready to graduate, and the professor had a policy that you got a one book pass. So I bought all the books, and then I came up, there's this book, it was Parable of the Sower, and I looked at the cover and I was like, I'm not interested. And I put it down. So I did not read it. And so when I got to Howard, I took Dr. Hampton's class, and he was like, Octavia Butler. I was like, oh, this sounds familiar. And I went back to my books. I was like, oh, this is the book I didn't read. So I say all that to say, like, it was just the cover, and it was, if I can find the picture of one of the covers, I was just like, I don't want to read it. I didn't know anything about her. I don't even think I opened the book. It was just the cover. I was like, it looks like dystopian lit. That's not what I want to do. I'm getting ready to graduate. But he came to the class, and I think I would have liked Butler's work anyway, but there's something about a teacher who is enthusiastic, and I don't even think that's the right word to describe who Dr. Hampton was. He was infectious. He walked in, he had on a full suit, he had on locks and everything, but then he was like, hey, yo, dig it. And I was like, dig it. Okay. And he would just ask, oh, it was great. But he he would make a story good before you even read it. You're just like, well, let me read what this is about. And Kindred is the first book that I read, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to take it slow. And I remember staying up all night to read it because it's terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And then every book after that, I couldn't put them down. I was super excited. I looked at the trope of vampirism in that class throughout her works. I was like, oh, the word vampire appears twice here. And so we had a fantastic time. It really was that sort of experience. And I don't think I read Kindred again for several years until I was going to teach it. And I was like, oh, all right, let me teach it. I'm going to start slow. And this was back in, I don't know, 2016. And again, I stayed up till 3 a.m. having to teach the next morning at like 10, reading Kindred. It's just one of those books for me that's unputdownable. But it was a really good experience, just the way she created worlds from aliens to vampires to traveling in outer space, and that she was so hard on herself as a writer. It's there's something so relatable about her work, and to see yourself centered in so many different ways in so many different situations, as a survivor, as a love interest, as a semi-villain, right? Dana's a likable character, but she does some things that are just like, oh, okay, we understand that you have to survive, but ooh, you gonna tell the girl to go sleep with the man, but you wouldn't do it yourself? So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Any other questions? Well, and maybe you should just go ahead and unmute because sometimes it's difficult for us to see the hands as well. Well, let me ask.
I'm sorry, Dr. Cassie. There's a question in the chat by Chloe Ramirez.
Okay.
Says, has the way Butler interacts with the genre of Afrofuturism impacted your own writing style and the way you teach?
Oh,
You can
absolutely.
repeat the question yeah, go ahead.
No, absolutely. Maybe not in terms of my writing style, but certainly the way that I teach and what I teach. So one of the reasons I went to Howard was because I wanted to have an experience where people looked like me. I've been in PWIs my entire life, and so it was the norm to have all these classes on Black literature. But that wasn't my experience in undergrad. And so when I began teaching, I was sort of pigeonholed into certain courses. So I was trying to design courses that were going to attract students. And so I teach a course on literary Afrofuturism, Black feminist thought, Black horror, Black vampires. I'm doing Black love in the spring, because, I teach at a PWI now. And if you're going to take a required gen ed course and you're not an English major, a lot of my students are like, this was the one that interested me. And I want all students to see themselves reflected, but I'm really interested in my Black students seeing themselves reflected. And so she's unapologetic in who she's writing about. Like, sometimes she doesn't even let you know the race of her characters till halfway in because I'm assuming they're Black, right? She was like, I don't feel like I need to tell you. So no, absolutely. Absolutely. I see Jacob Johnson's question. Um, it says, when first reading Kindred, did you have a hard time grappling with Ruth, with Dana having to save Rufus? Oh, yeah. I think I could understand it like the first couple of times because he's young and he's a kid and she's trying to educate, saves him from the water. That's real quick. The next time he calls her the N word and she's like, that's mean. Okay. And she tries to educate him. But as it keeps going, right? We understand why she feels like she has to save him because she has to survive in the future. We don't know what's going to happen if he dies. And then we don't know what happens if Hagar isn't born. But I think it's an unfortunate commentary that sometimes Black women have to save people to save themselves. Position that we're often put in, especially with like elections. They're like, oh, Black women will save us. And people are like, mm-mm, you need to save yourself. You need to do your part. Like, stop relying on us. And so, yeah, I absolutely had a hard time with that for sure. Um,
I think Chloe had another question.
As Chloe says, when asked about Kevin's character, Butler says that she introduces even as a character to make Dana's life more difficult. What do you think is Kevin's purpose as a character is? His purpose is multifaceted. So one of the reasons Butler wrote Kindred in general was because she encountered Black people who were just like, oh, if I were an enslaved Black person, I would have killed my enslaved masters. And she was like, I wanted to take a person with that mindset and put them back in time so they could really see what it's like. But she also, she people were also like I think they watched Roots and they're like, how come there are no good white people? So she made Kevin because she wanted to show what it was like to be a good white person. But even if you're looking at Kevin, he's not, the children are playing the slave auction and he's like, oh, they're just playing, it's just a game. And Dana's like, no, it's not. You can't just excuse it. And then he's like, oh, I think this would be a great time to live, the frontier. He's having all these comments, and she's like, okay, but no decent food, no basic housing, none of the things. Like, this is not a great place to live. So I think it's sort of this wake up call. Like, you think you're a good white person and you're still sort of removed from what's happening, even though you're right there seeing enslaved Black people. You're still sort of distancing yourself from it. It's so weird to see him do that. And I think what really helps is him getting stuck in the past for 5 years alone. By the time he too becomes a changed person, it's this idea that when you have an encounter with the past, what are you going to do? He could have just stayed very oblivious, but for him, he really had to confront who he was. And by the time he returns back to 1976, like, pencil sharpeners are bothering him because he's lived and experienced history. Um, I'm not sure that Kevin makes Dana's life more difficult. I mean, I guess it does with Margaret Whalen. She was angry that a white man would choose a Black woman over her. So in that regard, it makes it difficult. But he was sort of a soft place for her to land while they were together in in the past.
If I could really quickly, so I know that women and gender studies are part of your areas of focus. So since we're talking about Dana and Kevin, you comment a bit about sort of the gender dynamics or the commentary in the book.
Mhm.
I'll leave it at that. I don't want my question too specific, so you can go wherever you
No, you
want.
can make it specific. Yeah, go ahead.
No, because I was just thinking about because a lot of students when we were discussing the book in the class talk so much about one, just Kevin's seeming ignorance having to do with race, but I think they were also uncomfortable with what seemed sometimes to be mansplaining like certain things to Dana. And so like, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Oh, and typing that manuscript at the beginning,
Yes.
they had this whole fight, and so part of what Kindred does is we can okay, they've got a modern relationship, but we're supposed to be seeing those parallels from the past to the present, right? I mean, we may not want to think about it, but Kevin and Dana's relationship sort of mimics that master slave dynamic. There's equity there, but the blending becomes really hard, especially once when she comes back. She
Mhm.
thought he looked like Tom Whalen. There are tiny,
Mhm.
tiny references throughout the text where he was like, he had a look like Tom Whalen. He had a look like Rufus. And
Mhm.
that's got to be terrifying. It's a wonder that their relationship sort of survives um, after all of that. Um, but no, absolutely. And I think in terms of the gender dynamics in other ways, Rufus, that sort of relationship, their relationship comes from like mother figure, like Dana's a mother figure, then it becomes sort of like friend, and then it's hoping to transition to lover. Or at least on Rufus's part, that's what eventually happens. She kills him because he wants to rape her, and it's the one thing she said she couldn't allow. So, I mean, as much as Dana is, of course, saved by Black women, she really is put into a lot of peril by these white men throughout the text.
So I think Zoe has a question. She says, when Kevin tells her that she needs to survive and mentions that her ancestors were able to do it, she responds explaining that he does not understand how dangerous it truly is. What are your thoughts on him saying this?
Oh, Kevin. I mean, you know how sometimes people don't know what to say, so they just say something. I think that's part of what it is. Um, I guess it's supposed to be encouraging. And I think too, this is getting at one of the things that Butler was really interested in doing. Like, would you be able to survive? I know we make jokes when it's really hot. They're like, this can't be the same heat my ancestors survived in because I wouldn't do it. Okay. Right. So, I mean, I personally find Kevin to be highly problematic, really and truly. I do. He's what some of my students would call diet racist. You know, I will say in my new book I do one of the things that the slave narrative itself is supposed to do is to champion the cause for abolition. So the question I often pose is, well, then what's the purpose of a neo-slave narrative, right? Because slavery technically doesn't exist anymore, right? We can talk about 13th Amendment and all that good stuff and incarceration. And so what is it supposed to do? And so what I do think is that Kevin helps us think about what it means to move from an ally to an accomplice, right? So an ally sort of witnesses is like, oh, it's not that bad. Oh, I'm not that white person. I'm doing this. It's sort of about educating and informing yourself, but being an accomplice is putting your body on the line. And so I think over the course of the novel, Kevin moves from ally to accomplice. And we can see this even modern day past in the modern day past when he finds out that his sister is racist, doesn't want him to marry a black woman, and then by the time we get to the end, he's like, of course I helped try to liberate enslaved black people. He was like, I did what I could. So we see him move, I think, from some of these sort of uncritical commentaries about what should happen. Oh, you have to survive. Your ancestors did it. I think we see him move from this sort of obliviousness, this sort of ally, moving from that to becoming an accomplice, willing to put his body on the line in the same way that Dana has to do. Yeah, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of y'all's class conversations. My favorite character in Kindred. Hmm, Alice. Alice. Um, yeah. Such a tragedy, but Alice, I think Alice for sure. It's got to be Alice. And this is hard because I'm not the person who thinks that Butler writes likable characters. I think she writes understandable characters. I think she writes relatable characters. I can't say that I think that all of them are likable. And I think that's the conundrum for me because you're just like, ooh, Dana, girl, I understand. But like, what would I do in her situation? Would I do the same thing? So I'm not trying to talk down on Dana. She had an impossible situation that she was living through and experiencing. You mentioned the Afrofuturist impulses we see in different book covers for Kindred, but what do you think about the different adaptations, the FX TV series, the graphic novel? What did you think of the adaptations and what they did with some of the same themes and ideas you've discussed? So that's from Dr. Chin. So in terms of, I would like just a quick show of hands, but I thought that the FX adaptation had promise, and I think it had promise. Um, so I really like the idea of having a cell phone. Okay, if Dana is in the 21st century, what happens if she has a cell phone? What do we do with that? Not being able to check her time. I wasn't entirely sure how y'all could keep listening to music if your battery's dying, but that's neither here nor there. There were some changes that I didn't like, so that basically Kevin was a booty call. I think that marriage relationship is actually supposed to be really, really important because it does show how Kevin is a soft place to land in the book. So I didn't like that change, but I did like, the police linking back and forth, the link to the police, right? So, a cop coming up to your house, sort of making those connections more explicit in a way. The time travel piece, the ancestral heritage to the mothers, I think all of that had merit, but of course the TV show was canceled because it didn't go over well largely with audiences. And so I think there was probably more to uncover there with those adaptations. Now, the graphic novel adaptation, I love it. I love the work of John Jennings and Damian Duffy. One of the things I really like about it is it takes Afrofuturism to, well, on another side, by positioning Dana as sort of a comic book hero character, right? One scholar, Forrest Yerman, who actually was at Howard, I don't know if he's still there, he wrote a book chapter about that, about how Dana is positioned in this particular adaptation as a superhero through language. She has this sort of hero's journey, but also the use of like Pow Bam Biff, the sort of comic book characters. And so I like that sort of version of Afrofuturism. And even through some of the visuals that repeat, the use of coloring, the sepia tones for the past, and the colors for the present. So I absolutely love all of that. Does that answer your question? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Great.
I guess while we're waiting for maybe, because I realize we only have a few more minutes, maybe I'll ask this question. Because one of the things that you talked about is as a genre or even as an aesthetic, what Afrofuturism does is allow us to imagine Black futures outside of oppression. And so, if you could talk a bit about what Kindred's commentary would be on some of those futures, or perhaps maybe what students can take from the novel with regards to imagining different futures outside of oppression.
Well, I mean, the world is your oyster. Uh, well, and I think it's sort of hard too, because what does it mean to imagine a future in the current climate that we're in right now?
Yep.
Is your future just concerned with you? Are you concerned with genocide? Right? Does your future imagine spaces for other people? Um, so I don't know if that's answering your question. You're nodding.
Yeah, you are. But Jacob Johnson has a really interesting question, which is what role, and that's something that we haven't talked about, not just in here, but I don't think I personally did as much of thinking through it in the class itself, because we realized that both Kevin and Dana are actually writers. And so Jacob's question is about what role do you think reading and writing played in Kindred?
Oh, it's a major role. It's one of the things that actually links it back to the slave narrative genre is the scene of instruction. So Dana teaches Nigel how to read and write, but also writing is a form of freedom. It would be what Isaiah Lavender would call a literacy technology, the ability to read and write. It sort of becomes a lifeline for Dana. It's her livelihood in her modern day present, but it's hopefully her lifeline in the past where she's writing letters to Kevin, hoping that he can come get her, finding out that Rufus isn't how to do it. But it's also a way that she can write in code. If you remember, she's writing in shorthand where she can get her thoughts out. And so for me, writing across Butler's fiction, not just in this one, has a number of functions, and one of them is like writing as sort of scriptotherapy, as therapy, as a way of not healing yourself, but sort of working through trauma. And so I think that's one of the things that writing does for Dana, because she can write in shorthand to get her thoughts down because Rufus can't read. And so she can sort of talk to herself to sort of keep herself sane, which would, of course, link back to Butler herself. She would write as a way to make sense of things. She said sometimes when she was trying to write something simple, she would write poetry, sometimes bad poetry, she said, as a way to simplify it, as a way to understand, and just to think through. Writing really was, I think, both for Dana and for Butler. They both really were writing to live. Like it was really, really necessary because it's something that was denied, obviously, to Dana in the past. And so it's like, if something's denied to you, you really want to get it back.
Excellent. I have one final question also, Dr. Parker, and then of course I think we have it's 12:54. We have maybe another one as well. But I know that you noticed during the COVID-19, there were a lot of um, comparisons to Octavia Butler and COVID-19 and how her writing was very prophetic uh, especially as you have mentioned in the parable, the talents and so forth. Can you elaborate on that? What are they seeing? They're saying she's this prophet during COVID-19 and her work is very prophetic, so ahead of her time.
Yeah, and it was a term that she hated, honestly, to be called prophetic. And this was even when, like, even a couple of years after it came out, people were like, oh, your work is prophetic. She's like, oh God, I hope not. She was like, this is a cautionary tale. She was like, I don't want this to happen. She was a student of history. One of the things Butler wanted to do was to get a PhD in history. She never did. She was dyslexic. And so she was just like, can't do it. Um, but I mean, a number of things that, pandemics, disease, people not taking care of others by, doing their part, but also gated communities, the ineffective law enforcement, all of these things are there in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. The presidential candidate, while obviously she's not talking about Donald J. Trump, the phrase came from Reagan, but to see that and for a novel to start July 21st, 2024, and to see the things that she's talking about happening literally right now. I mean, she was talking about environmentalism, climate change, water shortages, ineffective police, the collapse of government, removal of environmental protections. There's so much stuff. And so it's not just the dates. It's the dates for sure, because the novel does begin in 2024. It's not just the dates, but it was everything that's sort of surrounding after. They're like, Octavia Butler tried to warn us. And she did. She really thought it was a cautionary tale. And she was like, I don't want this to come to pass. And it has. And part of the reason she's like, I'm a student of history. So she was like, I know where this goes if we don't make any changes. And apparently we haven't, because here we are. One question in the chat. Do I have time to answer it?
Of course, yes.
Okay, so it's can you give more examples of Butler's personal experiences being reflected through Dana? This is a fun one. So yes, so Butler and Dana are both left-handed. Both of them are writers. Both of them were gifted typewriters. Now, Dana's gifted a typewriter by her husband. Butler was gifted a typewriter by Harlan Ellison, who she had a major crush on. So unrequited, and he was a white man. And so one of the things that I talk about in my new book is, and I'm glad it's at the end because y'all would pepper me with questions, is about thinking about Kindred as a romance novel. Yeah, very uncomfortable. Not as a romance novel, but it has a romance subplot, thinking through Butler as a writer of romances. And so that particular chapter looks at Survivor, Kindred, and then Wild Seed, which I argue is the actual romance novel, but how she starts developing these romance plots. And part of that romance plot is reflected in she had a one-sided crush on this writer who was about 13 years her senior, in the same way that Kevin was with Dana. And so that sort of mentor type relationship that Kevin has with Dana at the factory, that sort of existed in real life with her and Harlan Ellison. Again, they weren't romantically involved. It was a one-sided, but she sort of wrote what she wanted in Kindred. So she was left-handed. Both of them were left-handed. Both were tall. Butler was like 6 feet tall. Both were very androgynous looking, had short hair. This isn't mentioned in Kindred, but Butler was sometimes mistaken for a man, the subject of homophobic slurs, and she was sometimes ran out of women's bathrooms because people just assumed that short hair, tall, raspy sort of voice meant she was in the quote unquote wrong place.
Thank you so much. I think, yeah. So I thank you so much. Just in closing remarks, thank you so much, Dr. Parker, for that truly inspiring and thought-provoking keynote address. Indeed, your insights have illuminated the deep layers of Octavia Butler's Kindred, and it has helped us to understand not only the text itself, but also the broader implications of the themes for our own lives in the classrooms and beyond. I want to take a moment to acknowledge all of you, all of our students, faculty, administrators, guests for being a part of this important conversation today. The purpose of the Octavia Butler Lecture Series is to challenge us to think critically and to engage with difficult questions and to reflect on the ways that literature, especially works like Kindred, can help us make sense of the world that we live in and the histories that carry with us. Now, as we continue with this semester, I encourage you to carry forward the ideas that Dr. Parker has shared with us today and apply them to your critical writings, your research, and your everyday interactions. Butler's work reminds us that the stories that we tell, the voices that we listen to, and the actions that we take all have the power to shape our future. So I would like to extend again my gratitude to everyone involved in organizing this event, from our first year writing program team to our faculty and administration, and of course to you, Dr. Parker, one of our very own, for sharing your time and expertise with us. Your presence here today has enriched our understanding of literature, culture, identity very deeply within Octavia Butler's works. So before we conclude, I want to remind everyone that this is just one of many events in our Octavia Butler series. We look forward to continuing this important conversation and engaging more deeply with Butler's works throughout the semester. And we will invite you, Dr. Parker, and all of you here today for the students. The students will have a panel also presenting this semester next month on their research on Octavia Butler's Kindred as well. So I thank all of you once again for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at our next lecture. Have a wonderful day, everyone. And this has been recorded and it will be published and uploaded on our first year writing program channel via YouTube. Thanks again. Have a great day.